Okay, I think we're recording now. Yep. Great. Well, good morning. This is the April 16, 2021 meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee meeting. Sorry, I'm just trying to admit Lauren, and it seems to keep failing. Welcome, everybody. Our agenda is up on the website for our Room Climate Council. And our first topic today is to approve the proposed agenda and some meetings from the last few minutes from the last few meetings. And maybe before we do that, we'll just pause and acknowledge Iris, who is a new member of the Just Transition Subcommittee, and I believe our new youth member to the Climate Council. And she is kind of joining us today to learn more about the work that we're doing and share her perspective from Just Transition. So Iris, I don't know if you want to take a second and just introduce yourself to the group.
Yeah, hi, I'm Iris Chung. I'm a student at Essex High School, and I am the new member on the Climate Council, the new youth member. So, yeah, hi.
Welcome. Thanks for your interest in our work. Okay, let's see. So we've got 3 sets of minutes from March 26th, April 2nd, and April 9th that were posted in advance of this meeting to approve. So does anyone have any comments or revisions to those meeting minutes? No, looking good. So unless someone says otherwise, we'll consider those approved. Great. Next topic is we're going to hear from Jane on some updates from the Climate Council Steering Committee that met yesterday. And then I think that will transition into a conversation about the technical RFP and carbon budget work that we've talked with Jane about in the past. So Jane, take it away.
Morning, everybody. I'll start and then encourage Lauren to cover whatever I miss, since Lauren's is a council member as well as a steering committee member. So we met yesterday, the steering committee. We had a really productive meeting yesterday. It felt really good to get through a number of issues. We were largely discussing the agenda for the upcoming Climate Council meeting on the 26th. And thinking about the substantive issues for that ahead of that meeting. The 3 main focus areas for that meeting will be a large conversation led by the Just Transition Subcommittee and supported by our new contractor, Climate Access, to consider and bring in input from all of you around what the public engagement plan will look like for the work of the Climate Council and in development of the Climate Action Plan. So we'll talk about the key milestones around public engagement, and then we'll also hear from them around initial early public engagement before we even get to the first date of June in what they're thinking. And that conversation started to happen last night at Just Transitions and really will be facilitated and thought about a little bit more next week at Just Transitions meeting in anticipation of a robust conversation about public engagement with the full council. That'll be our main sort of showstopper first up on the agenda with the Climate Council agenda item, and then we'll use that as a jumping off point to talk about, and this will really come back and influence all of your work, the draft outline for the Climate Action Plan. We've at the last steering committee meeting 2 weeks ago, we put forward a draft outline for the Climate Action Plan. We got really great feedback at that time. We did further refinement of the outline, and then also heard some feedback yesterday that we'll incorporate ahead of the meeting on the 26th. I'll just highlight one of the things that I have been thinking a lot about, especially with your role, Ag and Ecosystems, as well as rural resilience and adaptation, is thinking about your goals and what you want to accomplish for the Climate Action Plan for the December 1st due date. It's very clear what we need to do around mitigation with respect to the 2025 greenhouse gas targets. This is our only plan that we'll put out likely before that date comes around. But it's a little more open-ended with respect to the sequestration and resiliency goals and how your work feeds into the first plan and what you want to get done for the plan, thinking and what you want to more set up for further work past December 1st. So I imagine that will be a robust conversation. And I know I did my best at sort of using your work plan and task leads to feed into that outline. But it's certainly, Lauren highlighted yesterday some really pertinent, like it would be better to move some of the work that you're doing, which is really resiliency based, into the resiliency section, if that's how we break up the plan, rather than leave it under sequestration, which is the sort of broad headings of the plan. And so things like that, well, it'd be really great after the Climate Council takes up the outline to have all of you sit with it and think about how your work fits into the outline. So that'll be our next conversation at the Climate Council. And then finally, there'll be some smaller agenda updates, and then we'll finish up with consideration of the role of the Climate Council in the next few months, recognizing that the bulk of the work is really happening at the subcommittees, and how can the Climate Council support that work best. And the original idea put forward to the steering committee yesterday was the consideration of shorter, more frequent meetings of the Climate Council. But after some really great discussion yesterday, we're thinking a little bit more about the role of the steering committee in convening the co-chairs of the Climate Council, which is how we framed it in the process roadmap. And rather than setting up more council meetings with the full suite of counselors, using the steering committee, which already meets bi-weekly, to prepare the Climate Council agenda on 1 week, and then 2 weeks later to convene the co-chairs and have a conversation to create cross-pollination between the subcommittees at that level. So that's one idea that seemed to coalesce with the steering committee yesterday, but we'll bring that to the council for full consideration and discussion on the 26th.
Can I jump in for a second, Jen?
Of course, Billy.
Thanks. So I just wanted to note that I've heard from several of you kind of an eagerness to get going with the substantive work of our group, and I share that interest. And you know, I think one of the updates Jane shared is really critical to that pretty soon there will be this framework for the first report that I think we can really use as a tool to begin focusing the work of the individual task groups. And I think also once we get through the kind of ranking discussion and how we're going to consider the co-benefits of different strategies, once those two pieces are in place, my hope is that the individual task groups can really run with their work and make a lot of substantive progress. So I appreciate all your patience around all this process heavy work we've done in these first couple months, but my sense is that we're really going to be able to break free and run with the real work coming up in a few weeks now.
Yes, thank you for that, Billy, and I'm really excited to get there too. And I think that the outline will also allow me to provide further refined templates and work products for you all to feed that work into. And so I'm really anxious to do that for everybody with all of your inputs and obviously the input of the steering committee. So anxious to get there. There'll be small updates as well, which we discussed also at the steering committee yesterday around ongoing legislative testimony, and then ARPA funding, which if you haven't heard about is the next round of recovery funding coming into the state. And the governor has earmarked a large amount of that money for sort of no regret, what he thinks of as no regrets policies with respect to climate change work that we know is going to be a high priority coming out of this climate action plan, regardless of what other strategies and ideas we come up with, weatherization, electrification. And then the really exciting benefit is he's also putting forward a proposal to include and earmark $100 million for climate action plan implementation. And so that means not actually deciding what that money goes to, but allowing the Climate Council and the Climate Action Plan work to direct where that money goes once the plan is drafted. And so Secretary Moore will lead us in a conversation with that, and other relevant secretaries that feel impacted by that funding proposal will speak up too. So we'll have a more robust conversation about that funding opportunity at the council meeting also. So let me and ask Lauren if I missed anything from the steering committee, and then from there we can transition to talking about the RFP or answering any questions first about the steering committee meeting.
Thanks, Jane. I admittedly was distracted because it took me a while to figure out how to get in. So I'm in Teams browser mode and I can only see you. So I'm sure you covered it well.
Great. Yeah, and I will just say that the only other thing we talked about at the steering committee was there's been a lot of movement on liaisons with subcommittees, which I think is really great. It's really wonderful to have Iris here representing the youth voice, but also representing Just Transitions. And Iris did a great job yesterday at the Just Transitions Committee, bringing back information from your meeting last week, as did the other liaisons. And that work right now is really critical, especially as we consider public engagement. And so some of the other subcommittees are considering liaisons as well, and Chad Farrell from Rural Resilience will also sit in on cross-sector mitigation. So a lot of cross-pollination even happening at the membership level, which is really great as we start to dive into the subcommittee report. Abby.
I have wondered, do we need to have a designated liaison to rural resilience from this committee? Is that something that we should be thinking about because of the, as I see it, the cross-pollination that will likely happen, or is that not something we need to be worrying about?
I certainly think you could do that, and that would be beneficial. I also think that these the convening of the co-chairs once a month will start to bring forward the touch points where you'll need to creatively really ensure that you engage with rural resilience. I also think for the task leads, working specifically on areas that impact or have overlap directly with the rural resilience group, those task leads should be mindful of pulling in the right folks at the right time and ensuring that there's coordination there. So I think you could do that. I also think we can catch it in other ways if there isn't capacity to do that. How's that for an open-ended answer?
I like it. Thanks.
Yeah, and I know Lauren and I are going to talk a little bit about this offline too, but I will say that you're bringing them into the task lead conversations, I think would be really great. And I also think that they've struggled, that subcommittee, with sort of getting the natural landscape ecological perspective onto that subcommittee. Unfortunately, not for lack of trying, they reached out to 3 really great nominees, and all have declined to participate on the subcommittee after sitting in for a meeting or so, or just not having capacity to even do that. And so there are hopefully maybe other ways to get this expertise on that subcommittee. And if you have ideas, I'm excited to hear them. But we've also done a more intentioned effort to get A&R staff to support that committee, which we didn't have any for a while. So Rob Evans from the Rivers program is monitoring agendas and on all email correspondence to sort of step in when it's relevant to his work. And Jens Hilke from the Fish and Wildlife Department, who is an ecologist and works on community-based wildlife planning with planning commissions and regional planning commissions and our nonprofit partners, as well as AOT and others, will also monitor emails and participate when it's appropriate to his work. They neither of them have capacity to be there all the time, but I think that's one way at least to ensure some of the interests perhaps served by this subcommittee are represented there also. Go ahead, Abby.
Graham may kill me for this, but I did see that he's on the call. I have wondered if Graham, who is the policy director at Rural Vermont, might be a person that would be another person to potentially bring in. And again, I know that his plate is extremely full. Maddie Kempner from NOFA is another person that I would consider as maybe a good cross-pollination person to bring in, although again, I know her plate is full, but as to whether maybe NOFA and Rural Vermont could take sort of an alternating presence on that committee is something that I'm certainly willing to follow up with both of those organizations in regards to. I have, Graham is going to kill me. I have laid the groundwork with Graham, and I'm happy to follow up with him if that is something that you think could be of benefit.
Yeah, I imagine Erica and Catherine, the co-chairs there, would be really receptive because they have made a very conscious effort to get expertise.
Great.
Any other questions on steering committee updates or the upcoming climate council meeting? I will encourage folks. Oh yes, sorry, go ahead, Judy.
I guess it's just language. I keep wondering because you keep mentioning rural resilience and developing resilience, and to me, resilience is like being able to bounce back. And as the bottom part of the state floats away, I don't want them to be able to bounce back. I want them to be able to adapt. So do these resilience committees and tasks involve adaptation as well?
Yeah, the full title of the subcommittee is Rural Resilience and Adaptation. So perhaps I'm just shorthanding it too much. Thanks for your observation. But yes, they're thinking very much about that. So
great, thank you.
So just to, as we shift, I'll just say that I do think the Climate Council meeting will really be a robust conversation about engagement, which I know we all care about a lot throughout all the subcommittees. So encourage everybody to participate if you can. And then further on, you know, we had talked about the sort of milestones associated with your work and sort of presenting that up to the Climate Council. At this point in time, we thought about just how to handle that more efficiently. And we're thinking about the milestone presentations coming up for the steering committee meeting rather than this climate council meeting, to be hyper focused on some larger issues rather than everybody speaking at this meeting to the work of the subcommittees.
And I just would like to add to that, at our next meeting, next Friday, yes, we intend to have Pat Field from the Consensus Building Institute, the facilitator that joined us a couple meetings ago, join us again for a conversation related to timeline and milestones, so we can give the task groups a real clear, you know, we'll have the rough outline of the report, we'll have some sense of how we're going to kind of rank and prioritize recommendations, and then we'll have a facilitated conversation around timeline, deliverables, milestones with Pat. And my hope is that after that meeting, the task groups will have a real clear and concrete picture of kind of where they need to go and what the timeline looks like for it, and can get going on that work.
That's great. Okay, so shifting to the RFP, I'm not sure, I'm happy to have as many conversations as anybody wants on this, but what I'll do is just update you on the RFP and how I did and didn't incorporate comments associated with number 1 and number 2 in the scope of services. So the RFP is posted, it is live. I had on my to-do list sharing the final copy of the RFP with all subcommittee members, so you have it for your records, as well as if you know any consultants that you'd like to share it with. I'll also be responding back to everybody who put forward a proposal for the RFI and sharing with them the final RFP so that they can see what came out of their work and helping inform the RFP process. And so I got a lot of feedback between last week and this week, and did my best to accommodate as many comments as I could. And I'll just say that the final language for the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, as well as the carbon budget or carbon inventory, as I think we're calling it now, a lot of comments, and I want to speak to the ag agency staff. I'm hoping Ryan is on this call, but Ryan consolidated a number of really thoughtful comments from the ag agency to contribute to how we spoke to those 2 tasks. And in the end, I sort of let DEC staff trump the opinions in some regard to those comments. Some were incorporated and not all were incorporated, largely because the comments that were received felt better handled outside and pre-work leading up to the development of the review and critique of the methodology for the greenhouse gas inventory, as well as the development of the carbon inventory itself. So I would soon get out of my swim lane if I tried to get into the details that Colin and others gave me about why it wasn't appropriate to include all of them. But as Ryan and others on this call know, Ryan has graciously agreed to put forward some documents that the Ag Agency has prepared critiquing the way Ag is considered in the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, as well as considerations for the carbon inventory or carbon budget. He's agreed to share those with A&R staff, and we've agreed to have an internal meeting around those considerations to then bring forward sort of our perspective to both science and data, and I imagine the subcommittee as well, to consider that. And so sort of the next steps that I see really are what is putting together the proposal, is sharing the proposal with all of you, and then putting together a review team for the proposals that come in for ranking and selection of consultant or consultants. And so what I've asked of science and data was to step forward some subcommittee members to serve on that proposal review team. Cross-sector mitigation has also stepped up with a participant to review proposals. And because you guys have a particular stake in both the carbon inventory as well as the greenhouse gas inventory, as well as all the other components too, it would be really appropriate, I think, for someone from the subcommittee to step up and be on the proposal review team. I'd like to ask Ali Kasiba if, I'm sort of asking her in public, if she'll help review, knowing her critical eye and expertise around the carbon components. But it would really make sense, I think, also to have someone representing the ag interests to help review those proposals and help us select a consultant. And when so that's my one request. And then second, when I share the final RFP, which you can also all see on the business registry for Vermont, I would also frame out the timeline for when we would expect proposals coming in and their review and rank needing to happen, so that you can mark that on your calendar and we can try to do this in the most timely way possible. We extended the due date of the contract, of the proposals to May 3rd. So I just want to sort of say that again, because we had really hoped that we would have these contractors on board by early May, but we won't get proposals back till May 3rd. And that was a lot of feedback that I heard from science and data subcommittees, as well as cross-sector subcommittee members, that it was a really complicated RFP and that a quick turnaround was just going to be too hard on consultants. So they have 2.5 weeks. We posted it on April 14th. To review the RFP and put together proposals. And I will just say that I'm hopeful that we can then review and select a consultant pretty quickly, but just understanding the thresholds for the amount of money we expect to contract out, it'll take a minimum of 2 weeks to get anybody on contract, but I expect something more like 3 or 4 weeks. So I think we're looking at the end of May before we have consultants on board, just as a timeline for everybody.
Thanks, Jane. And to speak to your request for someone from this group to kind of participate in the selection, we do have a task group focused on the carbon budget, which is a big piece of that RFP from our perspective. As far as the ag expertise on that, there's Ryan and Alyssa. So I don't know amongst them if there's some willingness to kind of play that supporting role. Those might be, good folks to start with, since they've self-identified an interest in that work.
That's my hope.
Yeah, Ryan, I'm not sure if that's a solicitation, but happy to participate and offer what expertise we can from the agency, and I can be the liaison to do that.
That's great. Thanks, Ryan. Does that feel okay, Alyssa?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think May is going to be really busy for me, and so I'm happy to support if you need it, Ryan. But
thanks for stepping up.
And I don't want to preclude others who are interested in playing that role from speaking up, but I just figured I'd start the conversation off that way.
So I'll share the RFP with everybody, so you have it, and then I'll also share the timetable for review and perhaps the I would imagine it'll be complicated enough, the review and approval, that we might want to just schedule an hour or two for the team to get together to just discuss any questions or considerations. It's hard to know how many proposals we'll get. I hope it's not as many as the RFI, but just because of the amount of work that would be to go through 15 of these again, but could be. And then from there, we'll put out a timeline around review and selection of the consultant. So I'm hopeful that we'll have them on board. And I don't think that obviously having anybody on board precludes us from starting to think about, further thinking about the greenhouse gas inventory, both through the Science and Data Subcommittee. They're looking at the greenhouse gas inventory next Wednesday at their meeting pretty substantively. So I plan to share that meeting with others, subcommittees who may be interested in sitting in on that meeting to hear the dialogue that happens at that committee meeting, as well as starting to think about the methodology for the carbon inventory. So looking forward to working with you all on it, and excited to get the contractors on board. So happy to answer any questions at this point or move on.
Just put in a question to the chat whether the RFP is open to out-of-state entities.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the answer is yes, it's open to anyone who qualifies, right?
Yes.
All right, that's a lot to digest right there from Jane, but anyone have any questions or comments at this point for her? Okay. So thanks, Jane. Keep us posted as this all moves forward. And let's move on to the next topic. We're a little ahead of schedule, which is good. Next, so just to pause before we move on, the rest of the agenda, we're going to talk about the ranking matrix that folks have proposed, and we've all shared some comments around. We're going to get some updates to the extent folks have them from the task coordination groups. We're going to touch lightly on the inventory of existing programs, talk about our assignments and the agenda for next time, then take public comment. And I know there's some new members of the public joining us today, so thanks for your participation. There'll be an opportunity for you all to speak near the end of the meeting. So Lauren, I don't know if you want, I know you've worked with David and Alyssa and others. You've gotten comments from, I think Judy and other members of the group on the proposed ranking matrix. And I don't know if you'd want to kind of begin the conversation around that.
I can.
Or I can frame it if you'd like, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, I could also hand it over to David and or Alyssa for them giving the intro to this all.
Great.
Well, maybe I'll just kick things off, and then Lauren or Alyssa maybe could dive into the details a little bit more. But just to remind from last week's, we worked this. Lauren kind of kicked this off by kind of suggesting what is the framework we're going to use to make decisions and kind of rank, evaluate different ideas and proposals. And then that led to a question around how are we going to examine co-benefits, because there's a multitude of co-benefits, and our subcommittee is uniquely in a place of trying to look at all of the different, potential co-benefits, whether it's rural economic development and farm economy or forest economy, as well as, broader forest health issues as they relate to clean water and air pollution. There's just multitudes of benefits that are associated with the different ideas that we could consider. And so we're trying to think about how is there a structured way we could look at that. And cost benefit is one option, but kind of a fairly flawed one, and too narrow and limiting. And it's, for ideas that have the kind of complexity and opportunities like these. So we looked at multi-criteria analysis as a way of essentially not deciding what decisions to put forward, not a decision tool in itself, but as a way of informing our own decisions as a group about where we spend our time, to kind of have a relatively quick way to go through and evaluate ideas, and then a framework for those that we do decide to take a deeper dive on. Then we have a framework for kind of fairly quickly looking at the information that's available to us to assess them. So that was the goal. I'm sure we didn't get it right. In fact, you know, as we've talked in the last week, we've made some more suggested changes to it based on some conversations about resilience, for instance. But at any rate, the whole point is for this group to have a framework by which we work together. It's not the only way to do it. And if someone has a better idea, I think Lauren and Alyssa and I are all ears. So look forward to reactions to it. I think one of the concerns I've heard that I'll just respond to up front is, you know, whether by the way we've constructed it with a fairly, you know, a weighting process where plus or negative, you know, and then assigning point values to things might create a sense of objectivity or numeric, you know, results that are going to be the equivalent of making a decision. And I think I acknowledge that's a risk. So there may be a different way to approach this that doesn't involve quite the same level of adding numbers to rank things. So I think I speak for Alyssa and Lauren when I say we're kind of really hoping for a robust conversation about this. If we're not talking about this approach, this decision-making model, then because there's nothing, we are inventing this. Like, there's nothing that you can just kind of take off the shelf and say, all right, let's use this tool. We kind of have to make this tool ourselves for it to be successful. So I'll shut up there.
Thanks, David. Any thoughts or responses to that? I know that, you know, I really appreciate the work that you all have done and kind of the proposition that we'll need something to help put some structure around this work, because there's just so many ideas that we're going to come up with, and having a somewhat standardized way to filter them is helpful. And, you know, my initial concern was that kind of a numeric ranked structure for this might be too rigid, given the different benefits that are hard to compare one to another, and seeing this more as a way to help the group prioritize our kind of value system and the sorts of benefits that we think are most relevant to Vermonters, and kind of get a more of a high, medium, low type ranking of the recommendations based on those values. And it sounds like there's an openness from you all to moving in that direction. And I think that an approach like that would give us both the structure we need to sort out the many recommendations we have, but also provide enough flexibility that we can change things around and reprioritize in a more fluid way. So it sounds like it could serve that sort of function, which is great. And I guess another question I had is, I know that this originally, my recollection was that this originally started as a way to compare co-benefits. And I hear David talking somewhat about the primary benefits as well. And I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other. I'm just curious if you all have given some thought to whether this is something we would use kind of in the first instance to try to identify the primary benefits of different strategies, as well as the co-benefits.
So I might jump in and say, I got a couple of comments from only a couple of you. Special gratitude to Ryan for working with his ag team and sending in like multi-page edits late on Wednesday. I've tried to incorporate as many as I can, but Ryan, since we have space on the agenda, I'd love for you to push back anything that I might have captured incorrectly. But one thing that I would raise, and certainly look to, especially Alyssa and David, to make sure that I'm not off base in saying this, is that multi-criteria assessment tool is only one part of how we would be prioritizing our shared strategies. So I think of that is that Word document that has those co-benefits, the sub-criteria, they have climate resilience, environment, social capital, et cetera. And that we can move from a numeric score to a high, medium, low, or I think David's even mentioned like a green, yellow, red, a color scale that can make it a little less quantitative and a little bit more qualitative, but that would feed up into that Excel spreadsheet that we've created that has the other things that we would be considering, like the strategy type, the scale of the project, or the strategy, key partners for implementation. I'm happy to share my screen. I think I'm in normal Teams and working functionally okay, but I'm a little apprehensive to open it in case everything dies on me. But anyway, just to say that co-benefits trade-offs MCA tool is to be fed up into this larger strategy prioritization framework. And the two greatest benefits of it, as I see it at least, is that it provides significant transparency in how we're coming to decisions, not only for each other and across our different task conversations, but also to different subcommittees, to decision makers when they get the climate action plan, that they will actually have a digital copy or a hard copy, theoretically, of how we prioritize this work, as well as giving us a little bit of objectivity in this work. And in the absence of creating anything like this, it's really, we might tend to be more subjective. And as best we can, especially when weighing different quantitative versus qualitative impacts and opportunities, objectivity is really key in decision making. So objectivity and transparency. So I'll say that and leave the floor open for others. I can share my screen too, I think, if that's helpful.
Thoughts from the group?
I think Alyssa's raising her hand.
Yeah, I
Sorry,
apologize. I got bumped off of Teams from my computer when this conversation first started, so I missed the very beginning, and now this is on my phone. I think I can see you. Hopefully, you can see me too. I just wanted to encourage people to please weigh in. You know, I think that the lack of feedback is. I'm surprised. I think this is a really important tool and conversation for everybody to weigh in. It offers us a way to be consistent and transparent in our evaluation. And so if folks are quiet because they have a critique or an alternate way they want to do it, you know, sending feedback to Lauren this week was an opportunity. And I really think, I just want to encourage everybody to either in writing or verbally to share kind of how you feel about using this tool as just one piece of the way that we go about making decisions and being consistent.
I'll just add one quick annotation, which is if useful, Billy, and if we have time, you know, one thing we might do is take Lauren up on her offer to post it, or maybe someone else can do it if they have more confidence in their system. But we could just quickly pick something and walk through it. And I'll give two quick anecdotes. Like we did an exercise ourselves where we picked wetlands restoration as an item that we might recommend. And then we just clicked through each of the categories and said, how would it score here and there? We didn't fill it in. We didn't, you know, look at actual data, but we kind of knew, we had a sense of what we think the relative scale is of that, you know, that concept. And it went relatively quickly. And I think it might be useful for the full group to kind of go through that exercise and realize we're not talking about, you know, something that's at the level of a PhD dissertation, where we're just looking at something that we can all use in a transparent way that captures some of our thinking. The other is, it occurs to me, you know, and you all may have examples of these already that you've run into, but I know that in public policy, this came up a lot, you know, when I was working on the Lake Champlain issues back when I was in state government, where lots of people have a technology idea. They have a new technology and we love technology. Our society worships technology, and we're always waiting for someone to come up with a new gizmo that's going to solve all this. And so there may be something out there that we could all debate endlessly about how many pounds of, you know, tons of carbon or greenhouse gases would be reduced by this technology. So let's just call it technology X. And we all look at it, and when we look at it in the broader, more complex, you know, array of multi-criteria analysis, we realize we all hate it. Like, it would not fly in Vermont. We know none of us would like it for whatever reason. It would completely change our landscape or the way that we live on the land. and our relationship to each other, and we all hate it. And we don't want to spend another minute debating it. This is a tool that might just, we quickly run through it and realize we all hate it. And we just put it to the side. It doesn't mean that we didn't talk about it or consider it, or that we might not even reference it in our report, but we don't spend a ton of time debating something that we all agree is not a good idea. So those are my two quick anecdotes of why this might be useful to us. It may not, and I welcome other perspectives.
Thanks, David. Jay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so two comments, or three. So my general feeling is, yeah, I think that, you need some structure around these conversations to balance out, all of our different perspectives and values. And that this is, I feel like gives us enough to work with to kind of go through this process. So that's just my general reaction. Something that I commented on last time, and I probably should have provided this in writing, so I apologize for that, is that I do think that with the equity assessment being a part of the draft prioritization framework that this multi-criteria thing would be feeding into, that having equity as a very explicit sub-criteria is important, because what I find oftentimes is that when you don't make it explicit, you just assume that we all assume that we believe in the value of equity, and so that we've already made consideration for it. And so I just think that it's an important thing for us to kind of force ourselves to treat when we're having these conversations and evaluating things. And also it may reveal that for many things that we actually don't really have a good understanding or way in which we internally would score the equity of a proposal. So I would say that for me that just feels like something that's important to kind of include in a very explicit way. And then to what David was saying, there's this notion of, I don't know if people are familiar with sort of the 6 hats or the 6 ways of kind of thinking. And so there's definitely, this objective kind of way of thinking, like presenting facts and scoring. And then I think what David is saying is there's also an emotional way of thinking, of saying, how does this feel? And so, I think whether that's part of just the way in which we, act together as a group is at the end, we're asking ourselves, how do we actually feel about these proposals and recommendations? So that's just another maybe checkpoint along the way, is that we're intentionally, asking ourselves that type of question after we've maybe done more of a kind of a factual, analytical process.
Jake, I think. Sorry, I was just going to jump in and share some. Go ahead, Ryan. Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of build off of that, and from the perspective of ranking and trying to understand common intent and values, I think that a ranking matrix can provide a useful framework to try to put some substance to some of these objective questions of cost effectiveness, feasibility, while trying to incorporate some of the subjective criteria that is important. I think when making decisions, a ranking matrix can help inform conversation, and some strategies that we're all in agreement with will likely rise to the top. But I do think that a discussion to vet decisions to be floated from this group up to the full Climate Council is important as well. We can't, while I think this can be a useful tool to identify priorities, there's still a degree of conversation and subjective discussion that needs to happen to perhaps vet and find some final recommendations.
Are you all seeing my screen, just to jump in really quickly? Okay, I'm seeing nodding, cool.
I think John has his hand up as well, unless folks want to respond to Ryan before John goes.
Yeah, well, first of all, I like what I'm looking at quickly on the screen. I mean, I agree with David and Jake, and I just basically want to, at some point, what we're going to come up with has to be implemented by farmers on the ground and others, and and just bear in mind what is feasible for them to do, and isn't out in left or right field, is something that is really Vermont oriented, just like David mentioned. So that's my only comment at this point.
Okay, so I think these have been good comments. I think, if folks are willing, we've got some time letting the group run through one of the scenarios just to kind of see what sorts of results and what that process looks like. I would be interested in seeing that. So unless folks feel otherwise, why don't we spend a little time doing that?
Could I ask a clarifying question first?
Yes.
My understanding, maybe I could just ask simply to explain, the MCA is a subset of some of the ranking, or provides further ranking clarities or an assessment score that is input into a ranking matrix that has other considerations. Is that correct?
Yes, let me screen share let me see if I can.
Just want to make sure that hasn't changed as far as the framework that we're looking at.
Are you seeing the spreadsheet now?
Yes.
Yeah.
So this has been revised since the last time, largely from comments that we had in our last meeting, as well as what Ryan submitted. So this highlighted cell here is theoretically where either that high, medium, low, green, yellow, red numeric score value would come from that matrix that we'll go back to in a second. But yes, Ryan, this is theoretically where this will feed up to. You left some good comments. I'm happy to walk through the ones that you specifically made, or such as the scale, which would be, is it a local, watershed, statewide, regional type of project? Editing the key partners, not just key partners, but key partners for actual implementation. Making sure that there is a strategy type, which would be market-based, cost share, regulatory, programmatic. I'm sure there are more, but just to get that list started. And then something that I thought was a really interesting idea that this group should certainly talk about is how we look at feasibility. And Ryan, you mentioned potentially using the IPCC 6 feasibility criteria, which I just pulled the actual graphic up here. It's probably too small to see, but considers technological feasibility, economic feasibility, social, cultural feasibility, institutional, geophysical, and environmental feasibilities. So that's something that comes from the International Panel on Climate Change, and something that we could certainly look at as we consider feasibility of these individual strategies as well. So equity is called out here as well, as are the guiding principles that I'm hoping that we will be receiving from the Just Transitions group, but Iris might be able to speak more fluently to that than any of us can at this point in time. But then also note that we've included, to Jake's point about explicitly calling it out in the multi-criteria assessment as well, we've added that in there. So I guess I need to stop screen sharing unless we want to make comments on this. We can go back to the MCA and run through an example. Okay, hearing none, are we looking at the same screen again?
You've got your matrix up now.
Okay.
Lauren, just one thing, maybe before we run through the exam, I don't know if we need to do a specific roll call or whatever, but I am cognizant that we haven't heard from everybody about this, and I do just want to make sure that that everybody is on board. for utilizing this type of a framework to move forward within the subcommittee structure and work. So just wanting to implicitly call that out, that if we haven't heard from you and you're not on board for this, you know, we want to know, because that's really important.
Charlie's got his hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I'm on board, and I think working through an example would be helpful. So thanks again for this, to you guys.
Judson.
Go ahead.
Hi, Judson here. One comment that AFA made, and you don't have to address now, but thinking about the clarifying the categorization of the benefit versus co-benefit. So is emissions reduction the benefit, and then, for example, is resilience a co-benefit, particularly around adaptation resilience? So if the strategy is resilience, does it also get factored into resilience as a co-benefit? So parsing that out and trying to avoid overlap somehow. Thank you.
Iris or Judy, I know that Iris, I know you're new to this conversation, but I just want to make, you know, if you have any thoughts floating around, that you're free to put them out there.
Yeah, I'm okay with the idea of a ranking matrix. I think it needs to be the right one, because otherwise we're just codifying our biases in a way that makes it seem more legitimate. I'm not sure, like, I think that, well, it's important to like name equity as its own category. It should also have, there should be sub-criteria under each of those other categories that address equity, because we can't just like shove it aside into another category. It needs to be incorporated. And also below, there's some mention of just how it will affect BIPOC communities. And I think that we need to understand that that's not a monolith, and that there is a potential that some of these strategies are going to impact different people in the BIPOC community, and different, like, may affect Black people one way and other people other ways, who are also a part of the BIPOC community. And I think that that kind of needs to be teased out a little bit, so that we're not treating it as if it's a monolith.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for adding that in. Alyssa?
I just want to appreciate Iris's comments, and I think when we put these in, I really, you know, strive to learn how to incorporate actively anti-racist strategies in my work more. But this is a place where we would really love guidance from you and Judy and folks that I think are here to offer that expertise. And so if you can suggest the best way to write this in, that would be really helpful to making it the best it can be.
Judy, go ahead.
I too am looking at the equity section. Is the comment activity anti-racist? Is it that you're asking that the activity is anti-racist, or are you asking for an understanding of cultural humility?
I think when I wrote the list, it was the first, and I wonder if maybe we should include cultural humility as a different sub-criteria. Would you suggest that?
Yeah, I think it needs to be in there, because to put cultural humility in there helps various ethnicities understand whiteness. And also where you have serves targeted rural communities, do you want to include marginalized communities?
That's a great suggestion.
Disinvested would be another way. Disinvested would be another way we could frame that, I think.
Should I add that to the same one as rural, or should it be a second subcategory, or sixth, really? Judy, do you have a recommendation?
Well, there's a difference between rural communities and marginalized communities sometimes. Yep. And so I think I see it as two things. And there's a question about community and social cohesion. So community cohesion is like recognizing that there's racial and ethnic differences and how you handle it. And social is using those networks to help you solve a problem or you know, take on an issue. And again, I see those as two different things. So community cohesion might be discussion around a cultural community, a marginalized community, and social cohesion might be a discussion around how can they help, or how can they assist, or what problems do they recognize.
Thanks, Judy. That's helpful clarification.
I think I saw Charlie's hand go up and down, and I wondered if you want to comment.
Yeah, no, I was just going to agree with Judy that I think it's important when we separate marginalized communities versus rural communities, because we get into there's a geographic, like socioeconomic, cultural. I mean, there's different factors there that play into it. So I think keeping them separate is important, so we don't essentially try to pigeonhole all into one, basically. So thanks.
Should we have a quick discussion on disinvested versus marginalized and what we want to keep in the MCA? Abby, you brought up maybe using disinvested instead. If you want to elaborate, maybe.
Well, I did, but I did see Iris make a face, so I'm not sure that that is the right way to go. And so I just want to be cognizant of that. I certainly am not an expert on this, and so feel free to ignore that terminology if it is incorrect.
To be honest, I didn't know exactly what the term meant, and I thought it meant that those were the communities who weren't invested in this work, and I don't think that is true, but I looked it up and I agree with it. So sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was talking about communities. Sometimes I feel like marginalized has a different, disinvested are places that have cognizantly been pushed aside in terms of having resources distributed to them equitably, which I think is another sort of interesting framework, but not necessarily, how relevant or how necessary it is to go into the weeds over it. I'm not sure, but I did just want to mark that as a term I've heard as another way to illustrate sort of the ways that this is something that has been done to people, not that people have done to themselves. What do you think? Does David or Lauren or Alyssa maybe want to run us through a quick example example, I'm guessing some of the concerns around this that Billy raised earlier are that obviously this looks like a ton of stuff to filter through, and of course it is. You know, obviously we can take as much depth or detail as we need to as we move along, but I think that it's also just, this is a really, I'm hoping that this can provide a filtering framework for how we ensure both cohesion in the way that we come to the strategies within the task groups and bring them up to the subcommittee and therefore up to the council as a whole, and also that, you know, that we're being forced at every step along the way. I know that makes things more difficult to really think about what these things mean. There are a lot of assumptions in how we put forward better strategies or solutions or tactics. And so, you know, I think that it's important to build in a questioning point at every juncture for that, to ensure that we're not missing something along the way because we sort of have a bias going into it that something is good or bad or helpful or whatever. That is how I see it. But I also see it that, like, we have a lot of really competent, thoughtful people around this table, and that, you know, I think probably we can work through these things relatively quickly, as I'm hoping we will be able to demonstrate in this moment.
Yeah, I think we should do the wetland example, David and Lauren, because we've done that. And I think it took us less than 2 minutes, I think, to really, or maybe 3 minutes it took us to go through it. And the criteria have changed a little bit since then. And so it could be helpful to do that as an easy example. And then maybe we can look at a really totally different kind of strategy that folks on this team think we might be considering and see how that works too.
Sounds good.
David did a great job of leading us through it the first time, and I hope that he might be willing to do that again.
All right, I will. Although I'm really happy if anyone else wants to. So let's click through it. So climate resilience, and I do want to note, I want to echo something that Judson said, that there's one of the risks in doing this kind of analysis is double counting, that you kind of count for the same criteria or same factor in multiple times in different ways under each criteria. There's no way to completely protect against that. It's just something that we should raise as we go through it. And if someone says, you know, I think we already dealt with that in this other criteria, then we should call that out. Yeah, Jane.
I just wanted to add, before we go through this so I can understand it a little better in its application, Billy spoke at the beginning about when you all first started to propose this, we were thinking about this as sort of an added on evaluation. And maybe Lauren already got to this when we were looking at the previous spreadsheet that was up, but this would really be looking at co-benefits analysis of already prioritized strategies. And so I just sort of want to say that out loud and just sort of understand that a little bit for myself. Like, we will have already gotten to this suite of strategies that may be prioritized or may just be a batch of broad strategies. I would imagine that then within that we would have recommendations on topic areas or whatever program areas. So maybe the broad, like, I feel like I need the context, and I'm not asking this well,
yeah,
for
no,
where the wetland restoration, like what level of strategy recommendation are we at that we're now reviewing through this tool multi-criteria analysis? Is wetland restoration a recommendation that gets at a broader strategy? And now we're going to take it through to understand what those co-benefits of that recommendation is, so why it may be a higher priority recommendation than something else that's helping us achieve sequestration.
You ask a great question, and I honestly don't know how this process is going to play out, but I'm assuming that in the task groups that, I mean, which are still forming, that something like this will happen, that we will look to the various other state reports, other materials and information that the staff and the group members bring to it, and it will be throwing up ideas on, you know, the electronic equivalent of butcher paper. And that we'll start to settle in on, here's a set of ideas of policy approaches or funding or investment approaches that we want to explore. And then then, after having done kind of that brainstorming, that we'll use this tool in association with the other matrix to start to, as you say, to rank them and kind of figure out where do we want to take deeper dives.
Right. That's helpful. I'll see it through with the wetland one like that. I think the wetland one is an interesting one to go through because I imagine it's, it sort of sits in that no regrets policy, right? Like there's going to be a lot of multiple benefits that are going to come out, and I think we'll see agreement on that, but it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because some of my apprehension around this kind of tool, which I think Billy shared earlier, is, it's a public process, right? And so if wetland restoration, for instance, I can't imagine it won't, but we'll see. We talked about how it works out with the technology example that you said, where we all in our head know that, it's just not going to sit well in Vermont to implement something like that. And you run it through this and you see why it doesn't have any added value or co-benefits. But like something like wetland restoration, where I think many of us would come to that and recognize the value it has in and of itself for sequestration benefits, but the broad societal values that it brings also for other co-benefits. If something like that for some reason didn't rank high, that would be a challenge in a different way, right? And how would that then play out when things don't rank intuitively the way we think they would?
Yeah, and this goes to a really core question that I think we should talk about, and it's probably carve some time aside, which is what is the decision-making model that this group wants to use? Right. I mean, we're not making permit regulatory decisions that are subject to appeal, but we are subject to the court of public opinion, and the court of public opinion ultimately will inform some of the policies that are adopted. And we want to do this in a way that doesn't unintentionally create the sense that we have locked ourselves into an irrational process, or that we've ignored key components of this. And I don't know that I have an answer to that. But my own instinct is that we not approach this as a decision-making tool. We approach this as a tool that just informs our decisions, however we decide to make them.
Yes, I completely appreciate that and think that's the right way. I fully support that.
Yeah, that was really well said, David.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not sure about your screens, but Lauren, did you take it down on purpose, or did it?
I did, and I sent it to you and Alyssa and Billy as well. I just sent Billy a text to see if he could maybe share his screen as somebody more team savvy. I have to switch to phone at 11:20, so I'd hate to have to cut us off in the middle of because I had to stop sharing my screen. So Billy, are you able to? Did you get it yet?
I have it. I'm opening it, and I'm happy to share it if that would be helpful.
Thanks.
I'm just trying to understand what I'm sharing. So is it the Word doc or the
Word document? Yep.
I just want to find out do I get like hazard pay for facilitating here? Like at least maybe like a double my compensation rate or?
Nope.
No.
I've never get hazard pay. You don't either.
I think we're that bad, David.
Just quick pause. We've got about 20 minutes left for this conversation. We can take a little bit more time if needed. I think we have it in our agenda, but just wanted to kind of check in on that. I think we're going to go through this trial run of the matrix for a couple scenarios. I'm happy to share screen and drive, but it may be more efficient for Alyssa or David or someone who's more familiar with it to do so. So you just let me know if it's simple enough that I can do what you need me to do. I'm happy to share a screen, but if there's any complexity in it, it may be better for you to do it. So
no, if you'd be willing to share screen, Billy, and I think it'll be obvious as we scroll down, and I don't think we really need to fill it out. We can just, or if you want to, you can just throw in numbers. I think we should treat this like a purely hypothetical exercise. And ideally what would have happened, right? We would have each of us would have had the chance to fill this out ourselves with whatever ideas we had. And that we would go through and basically say, all right, let's start with climate resilience. Is there a benefit or an impact of increasing wetlands in the state in terms of temperatures and summer heat stress? Does anyone have information they want to throw in there? Yeah, Lauren.
I'm raising my hand. This is fun, David. I'm raising my hand just to say when we ran through it, Billy, since you're driving, we were specifically just looking at the directionality column. So negative,
Okay.
neutral, or +1 as a way to quickly run through to make sure that we're looking at impacts that way.
Okay, great. So we can do that.
Yeah, so is the impact of increasing wetlands on warmer temperatures overall summer heat stress positive, neutral, or negative?
It's probably neutral or positive, right? Enhances resilience, or maybe not at all.
So let's go for +1. So
Judy added a comment that says depends on where the wetland is. Judy, do you want to elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, so it's not going to be positive if it I mean, the land can only be sustainable if it's used for its intended purpose. So if its intended purpose was not to have a wetland, it's not going to work. So it depends on where you're going to make this wetland.
That's true, and that's a kind of goes to the nature of the policy. We might want to inform the policy to make sure that it considers that question. And there's also the question, there's probably a quantitative question in here too, that it may depend upon how much wetland capacity is, or potential is there in the state. It may be negligible when a scientist looks at it in terms of this. So this is one. Why don't we put it as neutral for now, Billy? I think it would be positive at a micro level, but there's larger questions about
done.
All right.
Then in terms of temperature variability, the kind of the shift in phenological, meaning I think the kind of changes in season start in beginning of, when does fall, spring, winter, summer start? And what is that?
Oh yeah, sorry, David, to interrupt. I just want to clarify from Judy's point and then Judson's comment also, because I think this is important. Let's just wetland restoration in an ecological context. So let's think, should we think about it that way? Because I do really feel like the two are very distinct. Like artificial, there's a stormwater wetland in my parking lot at my grocery store. That is a wetland, but it wasn't a wetland there before. It was created to capture stormwater. Are we talking about that, or are we talking about restoring degraded wetlands on ag land that was once a really high functioning wetland, and now we're going to put that back on the landscape?
Great point.
They feel like different strategies to me.
And I think I agree. And I think this is one of the benefits of going through this exercise is we might, as we go through it, start to realize we need to refine our recommendations and ideas to be able to really evaluate them. So I see that Billy put it as kind of restoring wetlands in a suitable ecological context. So more presumably along lines of, historic wetlands that were converted and if allowed to recover would recover their function. So how much effect on temperature variability? I'm going to just, Ryan.
Thanks, sorry. Trying to build off of Jane's comment. Current state policy is seeing no net loss of wetlands, and so I'm not trying to dig into the details of what this means, but is it the voluntary restoration? Is the state policy to mandate? Are folks compensated? I think those are some important considerations perhaps down below, maybe not these first outputs that might happen, but just the strategy itself, how are we going to get there, I think is, and maybe that's not part of the MCA portion of it, but I do think how that's defined is important, but certainly you can evaluate whether having more wetlands is good or bad, and I would agree that it's net good to have more wetlands.
So one part of this exercise that we might want to do, given both Ryan and Jane's comments, would be to have some note taking that goes with each one of these, that we say questions to be answered. If this one kind of passes through the needle of being something that we decide we want to dig deeper into, then we say, here's questions we really need to take a deeper dive into. What kind of restoration, what kind of location? And then to Ryan's point, what policy are we talking about? Is this, tax incentives? Is it payments? Is it regulatory? And I think we're not going to be able, this this chart won't answer those questions. Those are kind of larger political policy questions that have costs and other variables that are built into them. This is helping us make that first cut on, do we want to spend time working on wetlands restoration as a key policy outcome? So I was just going to jump in and say on temperature variability and seasonality, like I suppose globally, if everyone restored wetlands at this level, it might, but at the state of level of Vermont seems less likely. So I'd put that 0. Precipitation increases. I think that is referring to, this is something much more localized. You know, as we see in overall increases in, you know, Lake Champlain level responds to the, you know, just the dramatic increases in 2011 of increases in precipitation. Is that something that wetlands could help respond to? Does anyone have an opinion on that?
Yes, I think they can help absorb high levels of precipitation.
Yeah.
I see Judson has a hand up. Or maybe it's Judy.
Judy and John as well.
Yeah, I'm back on the other one about phenology. So increased temperature, does it disrupt phenology? We've lost a lot of vernal pools this year. And so the phenology is totally disrupted because of that. And so if you were to make some of those vernal pools into wet areas, that would help with the phenology.
That's a good point. I maybe we should put that at point 1. I was thinking of it more as a global issue, like how would it affect it globally, but your point is well taken.
Great.
Extreme precipitation, it seems to me similar to kind of the kind of overall precipitation changes, that extreme events, particularly flood damage, are something that wetlands would have a positive effect on.
Yeah.
Severe wind and storm, I don't think that would make it worse. It's hard. Maybe it would. There'd be some benefit.
Sorry, David. Just a very quick comment on where we're at. I mean, I certainly know where I live. During Irene, the fact that Cornwall Salisbury Swamp absorbed a huge amount of water that came down Otter Creek and probably prevented a staggering amount of damage in the town of Middlebury. If that water had not been able to dissipate in those wetlands. So that's just an example of something. The other is, you know, I was on an NRCS event about 2 or 3 months ago, and they were pointing out that they've been restoring wetlands at the rate of about somewhere around, I think, 500 acres per year for the last 5 years. I'm just putting that in as informational.
Yep,
stuff.
That's good. Thank you for that, John. Any opinions on? I'm not seeing off the top of my head any kind of relationship between wetlands restoration and, you know, severe wind storm events, but maybe there's something I'm not seeing. Okay, then maybe keep that neutral, Billy. And then on drought,
I think Judy's got her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I can't push buttons fast enough. I'm thinking about wetland area in Chittenden and what they were impacted by severe winds and storms because the beaver had built a dam and the dam broke. And so the whole side of the thing totally destroyed the land downstream. So it can be impacted by storm hazard and severe wind.
So did the fact that the wetlands created by the beaver, did that make the hazard worse? I mean, is that it? So that our wetlands have?
No, the storm made it worse because there was so much water the dam wouldn't hold and it broke.
Got it. And that seems like it fits within extreme precipitation as opposed to wind. But maybe that suggests that we should think about what storm means, Alyssa, because storm could be, it might overlap with extreme precipitation, and that there's a double counting.
Right. Well, it's just a tool, right? To help us discuss. But yeah, I agree. I think that it sounds like what Judy was describing was more about how the wetland enhanced resilience to extreme precipitation and not resilience to wind. But the wind was kind of the impact. Judy still has her hand up.
Sorry, no.
Okay. Okay,
Yeah.
drought.
Also, I think it's important to consider the difference between we're looking at does the practice, do wetlands create greater resilience to severe wind and storm hazards, not do severe wind and storm hazards impact wetlands positively or negatively. So just, I think that's, Judy, a clarification too for how to maybe look at these sub-criteria.
Okay, I'm going to move us. I think they do enhance resilience to drought, increase water holding capacity in the landscape, and maybe would be neutral for pest and disease pressure.
I don't actually think that's neutral. I know at Fish and Wildlife, we've gotten, while there's a perception that restoring wetlands creates more mosquitoes and insects, actually, there's been a lot of good press lately around wetland restoration actually helping with mosquito control and other, because wet reed canary grass fields are about as bad as there's possible for mosquitoes, but actually having functioning, healthy wetlands that have mosquito predators in them. So there's actually been a lot of compelling stories about how wetland restoration helps with pest control.
So we'll go 1 there.
Yeah.
I would do it, yeah.
All right. Is David still here? Water quality impacts of
His hazard pay didn't come through and he left, I think.
Oh, okay. I don't see him, but I'm not seeing everybody. If he's not here, I can jump in and take us. Water quality, I think that's clearly a +1, right?
Yeah.
Can you disagree? Air quality, I don't know as much, but maybe Allie does. I think if we don't have information, maybe we leave it neutral in this process.
Alyssa, this is John. Sorry, if I look up on this wonderful source of Wikipedia, if you look at wetlands there, they tell you that wetlands around the world are one of the greatest natural sources of methane. So I don't know the answer to that. I have no idea whether that's true or not, or accurate or not, or to what degree, but I'm just mentioning that it does talk about wetlands producing methane. So I don't know if anybody has better information, or I cannot believe that there is better information than Wikipedia. But,
that's one of the great answers we'll get through our carbon budgeting exercise.
Yeah. And I sorry about that, everyone. I'm at the end of a long road and lost power for a sec. But that one, John, that's a great example of one where if I were leading this, we were in real time, I would maybe put a question mark there and say, this is one we've got to do a little more digging on. We need to get someone who has some expertise in this and get an opinion.
Well, I'm glad to hear you didn't just dismiss it as idiotic. So no, I would like to know more.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the point of this exercise too, is that we do this. This is also accessible to the public, and the public will be able to weigh in with questions too on things that they think we should consider. Yeah, Jake.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned it, David, just like accounting for these questions, that this is helping us kind of raise up these issues. And maybe there's not enough room to have a column for this, but like just a way to account for those questions that are arising for the specific sub-criteria and our conversations around it. So just if there's a way to maybe build that into the matrix or the table, but I just want to make sure, yeah, that we do like have a way in which to systematically capture those types of questions that are arising.
And I would, just on this air quality point, there's obviously, well, not obviously, but there's different elements of air quality. There's like particulate, there's, and then there's carbon. And I don't know which one this is getting at, because I think we've had Allie confirm that John's research is accurate. Thanks Wikipedia, that wetlands do produce methane. So maybe from a carbon accounting perspective, they're a negative, but they may provide other services related to air quality. So I think for you creating this this filter, just having some clarity around what the intent of air quality is would be helpful.
It might also go to the question that Jane raised at the very beginning too, that some like a wetland that wants to be a wetland might be really good at sequestering and storing carbon, and one that doesn't want to be a wetland that we just invented may not be so good at that, and that might be a variable that we build into our thinking.
Right. Or what's the net emissions of a wetland? Even understanding that it emits some methane, it's still, depending if it's a natural one, may still sequester more than it emits.
Right. Yeah, biodiversity, I'll just speak for Audubon and say this should get a +2. But at least a 1 would be my recommendation. Charlie?
Yeah, thanks. Following up on that last comment, in terms of, these aren't happening in a vacuum. One of the considerations might be like, what's the alternative to it? So a wetland's impact on air quality in terms of just being a wetland is one consideration, but also, are we looking at a wetland that would otherwise be a housing development or a tiled pasture or an X? So it makes it a little bit harder to quantify in terms of what's the balance that we're looking at.
Right. That's a great thing. And that going to Jake's point, whether it's on another whole column or it's down at the bottom, but we capture a note that said, question we have is, does this policy take into account the opportunity costs or opportunity benefits? Soil health. I'm not quite sure how to count that. Often we think about soil health in terms of the ability of the soil to produce crops, but this is certainly soil health to the extent that it means, relates to how much carbon it stores. That might be something that we haven't counted yet, or there may be a way to count it in terms of the amount of biomass that it produces, that the biomass itself holds carbon. I'm not sure. Yeah, Judy.
So the soil health has more microorganisms to capture more carbon if it's a healthy, nutritionist soil, right? So that's why it's so good in riparian zones, because it gets new nutrients every year from upstream, and so you always see that pH of 7 in a riparian zone. So the question would then be, are you going to see that around the perimeters of a wetland as well?
Yep. And I'll just note too, I agreed. And this is one of those places where I also want to flag the potential for double counting. If we have a carbon budget separate than this, we may have looked at wetlands in a carbon budget way. We may have looked at it in the context of air quality, and we might look at it in soil health. And we just need to be clear that we're just counting that once, like we don't double or triple count a benefit by accident. But agreed, I think that should be a 1. Then shifting to an area where there's going to be less science, I think, but equally important, or kind of what's the cultural implications. So in terms of identity, how do we look at wetlands in terms of identity?
Yeah, we could ask the question, does the restoration of wetlands enhance cultural identity? Judy.
Yes. To Native people, the wetlands are a grocery store. Everything you need to sustain yourself are in the wetlands.
Agreed. And I think that is true in a broader way too. I mean, I think, you know, there are many Vermonters who benefit and have a sense of identity associated with wetlands that they live near or around, which goes to the next one, sense of place. Is that, how do we, how do we score that? How is that different than cultural identity?
Well, again, it depends on the place and where it is. Because as I've been saying right along, the soil is the birthing place and the spine of the land takes care of the soil, and the wetlands are the band's place where they take care of the clean water to take care of the spine of the land to take care of the soil. So if it was a pre-existing spot that's being restored, it would be a high value. If it's a new spot, not so much.
Good. So this is that helps us think a little more narrowly too about how we want to think about this policy and details of it. Abby, I saw your hand up.
Sorry, my background noise. I feel conflicted about saying this, but I do feel like I have to bring up the tricky issues that do come up sometimes around agriculture and wetlands. Not going to go into that deeply at the moment, but that is a thing that has come up before, and I think would need to be taken into consideration somewhat as we're framing these you know, that is something that might come up, that, you know, sometimes the places where a wetland restoration needs to happen, and Jane could probably speak to this even better than I can, you know, is a place that has historically been farmed in Vermont, and some of the cultural issues that can arise from it.
Well, and I totally get that, and make even another one challenge, I think, about this that comes up in some communities, and that there are many towns and villages in Vermont that were built on fill, and so on places that used to be wetlands. So there's a sense of place associated with the fact that it's no longer a wetland. So there's that's an interesting factor to think about, how to talk about. We have a choice of putting it as a negative, neutral, or positive directionally. We can also put it as a question mark if we want to do some more exploration of what we're talking about, because it might be that as we evaluate the policy that the policy could sidestep this issue if it's a question, or might answer it.
Well, I don't know. As a working example of this, I think this illustrates a tension that might come up. I mean, I'm leaning towards saying that it's a positive. I mean, if we can restore wetlands that can restore a sense of place for Indigenous people for whom this land has been removed from their care, then that certainly seems like a really important way to frame it out, and something that we would need to work into the way that we structured any policies. I don't know if anybody else has thoughts.
Yeah, Alyssa.
Yeah, I think this is one where you might leave it blank or put a 0, since you hear arguments in both directions, and we're really supposed to identify directionality. And so I think, since it's not completely in one direction or the other, it's really site specific. And as we get down this list, I think some of the evaluation gets really into indicating that the way that the policy or the program is enacted and where it is enacted has strong implications both for like equity and some of these other important co-benefits. So that my vote would be either a 0 or a blank.
Well, good. Well, and would you accept a friendly amendment of a question mark, in part because what I would like to do is flag it as something that, as we make a recommendation, let's say we as a group would decided this was one that on balance we wanted to put forward, that we would want to have captured in our recommendation that the policy or approach needs to be to address this issue, that it needs to be organized in a way that prioritizes restoration of wetlands where there is a benefit to sense of place. Spiritual, in some ways, I think Judy has addressed that already, and there's a connection, I think, between kind of the values that people draw in terms of sustenance as well as their sense of spiritual connection to the place. But maybe there's additional ways to think about that. I think that's a +1. True. Aesthetic seems similar. Although I will share, I won't name names, but there was a high-level ranking official when I first was DEC commissioner who called me into his office and said, "Can you explain to me why my brother-in-law's, field that's all grown up and looks like just junk is important? Like, it looks terrible. It looks so much better when it was a mowed hayfield."
I was gonna say aesthetics is a very tricky criteria to get a consensus around.
Yeah, no, clearly, the idea of a swamp and as being a dismal place is part of our cultural history. But
right, some biases there. Yeah.
This might be one where we have we could decide on a decision-making model as a group. Do we want to have a vote? Do we want to kind of see if there's a disagreement among us? Do we want to try to reflect what we think the broader cultural values are in Vermont? For my part, I would recommend a 1 and ask if there was any opposition. If there was no opposition, then we could just keep going. But we might, as a group, want to have a different model. Charlie.
Yeah, I just think it's a tough one because I run the same thing with forest management where it's hard. People say like, "I'm so sorry, my woods are so messy," and it's like, no, that's good. So part of this is like, what is the existing aesthetic value, and what is the education element that is needed to get people there? So it's a tough one. That's not a real answer, but I feel your pain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Does anyone have an objection to that, to putting that as a positive? Alyssa.
David, didn't you this is
go for it.
Ryan, didn't you just share an anecdote about a high-ranking official? I do think that there is perspectives out there when doing outreach around programs that support voluntary enrollment and permanent easements, where you find folks that absolutely agree, this is a bad part of a farm. It would be great to turn it into this. And then you'll find others that want nothing to do with it, in part based on aesthetics. So I think acknowledging that there are many different viewpoints, I don't know if this group can make a choice about which one is the right one.
Good. I think that's a great point. Let's try this as an alternative. Well, I see other hands up. I see Charlie, Abby, Jake.
I'll jump in. I'll jump in. Well, I feel like maybe not for giving a score for this right now, but that particularly aesthetic needs some we do need some form of definition or what we're kind of aspiring for when we talk about this as a criteria, because obviously I think especially aesthetics, like you're getting into very subjective judgments without some kind of basis for what aesthetic are we talking about when we're evaluating this, because that's where I think we're going to run into problems of giving it directionality. Is like, well, the landowner has a perspective, but we as a group, do we have a coherent idea of what we mean by a desirable aesthetic?
Agreed. Well, and this feeds into something I don't think we have time to get into it right now, but I'll just tee it up as a question I think we should get to when we get to this criteria or similar ones that have some subjectivity to them. What decision model do we want to use to decide it? Is it the group of us kind of, do we want to vote on it? Do we want to do it by consensus? Do we want to reflect the broader, as Ryan points out, the broader cultural debate? It might be if we did that latter, we might just leave it as a 0 and say it's neutral. There are people on both sides of that, and there's other reasons we want to move forward with this. Education and knowledge. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I have one more process question about this. Doing ranking metrics or filling out stuff like this, it tends to be an individual filling it out based on their subjective or objective opinions and returning to the group to compare how others thought on a particular topic. Is the intent of this MCA and the ranking matrix to do this as a group, or to work individually and then return to share the different perspectives of the members of the subcommittee?
I'll just share my personal hope that we would do what you just described in terms of having individuals fill it out first and then bring that to the group. But it wouldn't be, I'm imagining that there would be a group conversation like this so that each of us could be informed by the each other's perspectives.
Great, thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah, but again, I'm not the, the chief of this. So like, I don't get I'm not the deciderator.
I'm just cognizant of time, and since this is just an exercise, I'd say let's try to get through this one. But this is a great conversation.
Okay, I think we've got just a couple left, although the last one is in some ways one of the more challenging ones. But education and knowledge systems. I'll vote just because I have the mic in favor as a plus. I think about all the ways in which Audubon uses wetlands as a teaching tool.
Great.
So then equity. I'll raise an issue that I'm a little ahead because I had a chance to think about this, but I raised with Alyssa and Lauren, that many of our many communities in the state are located in places where the land is more affordable, and oftentimes the land that's low-lying, it's either converted wetlands or it's right next to wetlands, has, it may be where the local mobile home park is located, for instance, or manufactured housing is located, and people that have less. So there are ways in which, there's other sub-criteria, I forgot about that. But anyway, there's a way in which wetlands restoration may come into direct conflict with needs for people to have affordable housing. And that's an equity issue that I'm not quite sure how we count that. But let's use as community engagement. Is there a community engagement role for wetlands?
I would say yes.
Yeah, I think you described it, David, with in part with the educational value.
Yep. Is it actively anti-racist?
I'd give it a 0.
And then serves, targets rural communities. I have a question about that based on what I was just describing, but that'd be a place I'd want to do a little more thinking. I know culturally there's been a tendency wetlands have been a very divisive issue politically and geopolitically. The rural communities have tended to see the protections around wetlands as an imposition on their ability to use their land the way that they want to. So, all right, well, so that's that, this doesn't answer the question of whether we'd move this one forward entirely, but as Jane predicted, there's mostly positive directionality associated with this. And, we would have gone through a little more detail, maybe, or maybe this was it. Maybe it was just a high, medium, low exercise. And then we could look at this, compare it to other ideas that were kicked around, and then decide, is this one we want to go deeper and explore some of the ideas that we hopefully would have captured in the notes section that Jake described. So I'll hand it back to you, Billy.
I think what I've appreciated about this process, and I just want to throw this in here quickly, is that I think, right, we're all trying to figure out how to move forward and how to get to the substantive work and how to start putting things on paper. And I at least see this as a great place to actually start the real work of putting the pieces, the potential strategies. You know, all of us are so engaged at so many different levels that I think probably coming up with a range of strategies is not going to be that difficult of a thing. The thing that is going to be difficult is figuring out how we put the strategy, how we word the strategies, how we put them forward, and how we filter them through to ensure that, as we've talked about, there are, you know, the co-benefits are acknowledged, the trade-offs and the maladaptive potential is also acknowledged. And so what I loved about this is that this gives us a place then to take that strategy and then more specifically figure out where the further research is needed, where are the questions that need to be asked to those questions, and which communities do those questions need to be addressed, and things like that. And it's sort of organically, through working through this process, it then identifies how we might go about structuring things in a more thoughtful and nuanced way. I know that this took a long time. I'm sure that there are plenty of us that are worried about the amount of time it took. I think that we need to look at this, as we've talked about a lot, as an iterative process and as a tool. And if it's not serving us, fine, but I do think that what this serves to show is that this is a good way that we could start to come up with the more tangible pieces that we need to build into the strategies as we suggest them. Judy?
I agree, Abby. I think it's a good place to start. And I don't think time should be an issue. It's when everything's together, everything's ready, it's time. So I think we should take the time to do it right, and it allows for all voices to be heard. And I think that's good about it. But I would also like to mention that there's a question in the chat box from Sonia, and I would like to know the answer to that question, because I have a comment depending on what the answer is. She was talking about, it came up when we were talking about aesthetics. So could somebody answer?
Sonia's question was the intention to include attractiveness to tourists as a component of the aesthetic cultural service, example, bringing people and funds to Vermont? I will admit that the aesthetic question as an Act 250 commissioner, for example, is one that is highly subjective and a really interesting one over which to work. In these examples that I've seen them, I did have the thought during this that potentially that might be some language that we could utilize for that, as it does not rely solely on the question that Sonia is asking. And on my personal position, and Judy, you'll probably say it better than me, is that I'm sorry, but this attractiveness to tourists, as far as I'm concerned, at some point needs to stop being the primary focus of the strategy that we're putting forward, or the reasons to which we're doing this work. You know, I think tourists love Vermont for what we have here, and there are reasons for that, and that needs to become more of the framework that we use as to how to maintain what we have and make it better. And, you know, the tourists can come second to that, although
that's exactly how I feel, because that particular question is what is answered in rural Vermont and in 1931, when they discussed increasing tourism. The Vermont Eugenics Survey discussed increasing tourism, but specific kinds of tourists. And so I would not want to be involved in anything that goes down that path. Our goal, I believe, is to create a better environment, to sequester carbon, and bluntly, to hell with the tourists. So I don't know what how anybody else feels, but.
Well, if I could present a slightly different perspective, as we're thinking about recommendations to make, we may not want to make it, I mean, different people have made different perspectives on how the economics fit in, but it just seems to me that it's relevant to the decision makers, the ultimate policy makers, to have a sense of whether a recommendation, whether it's wetlands or it's forests or it's some other idea, whether there's economic benefits to that for the state that accrue to local communities, whether it's local bed and breakfasts or it's restaurant, the hospitality industry or what have you. That just seems like a relevant consideration in a co-benefits analysis. But with that said, we don't have any significant kind of economic analysis in this co-benefits setup, and maybe that's evaluated someplace else. It's a question that I put to the group, because it seems to me we would miss an opportunity if we had an idea that scored highly on a bunch of co-benefits, and it was also had an economic benefit. Like that could be a really good plus up in terms of our ability to advance that idea with policymakers. But maybe that's for others to do, not ours.
Okay, I'm gonna suggest that if there's one or two, Alyssa, please feel free to chime in. Judy, if you have another thought, but then I think we need to wind the conversation down after these final comments so we can get some public comment in.
Great. This is a direct response. We didn't go through all of the criteria. There was like a second page, which included some of those economic and rural economy criteria that David had put into the original one. So we can include those. And I think that that would be wise, even if it's just broad strokes.
All right. Jane, looks like you're good. Judy, any last comments from you? I'm not sure if your hand is up from before or not.
Maybe it is, but I still think that it is wrong to put capitalism or economy or anything on the forefront of protecting land. The land has to be the part we're working on protecting, not the economy.
Okay. Great. Well, I think that's a good place to leave this conversation. This tool, I think, has served its purpose so far, where it's really a vehicle at its highest level for us to talk about our shared values and where, the larger impact of the work of our committee and how we can leverage the most positive outcomes for Vermonters through investments in climate mitigation and resilience. So thank you for those who helped pull this together and for everyone who shared comments on it. I think we're going to skip over most of the remainder of our agenda. And I think next week, if folks are agreeable, we're going to have Pat, the facilitator, with us. And I think we should probably spend kind of equal parts time on milestones and timeline conversation around the substantive work of the group, as well as revisiting this ranking matrix to see if we can kind of get it to reflect on some of today's conversation and get it to the next level where folks are agreeable to use it as a tool going forward. We can also get some task group updates and any other updates on the inventory and pieces at that time. Does that sound good, or any other thoughts, questions, suggestions on that? Excellent. All right, well, before we move to public comment, anything else members, staff want to share, question, remark on before we move on? Great, well, thanks everyone for that conversation. It was a good one. All right. Members of the public, any of those who'd like to speak, please raise your hand. I see Gordon Merrick, Jeff Forward, any others who are unable to use the hand raise function, please unmute yourself and make yourself known. Okay, so Gordon, why don't you go first, then Jeff, and if each of you could take a couple minutes to share your comments with the group, we would appreciate them.
Great, thanks. So I just had a quick question and comment just regarding the matrix and the like co-benefit CMA and just or MCA. I always get acronyms wrong, but just wondering if that will be posted on the supporting documents, like agency of administration site. Sorry.
Yes, I believe we will put the draft that folks were looking at today up there. And I don't recall how it's structured, if it's under our specific work group or under the supporting documents for the larger council, but it should be up there later today or Monday. Thanks.
Thank you.
Sure. Jeff.
Thank you for your time. And you know, something I've been mentioning to all of the subcommittees and the group as a whole is that one of the pleasures and joys of living in Vermont is that we have such capable and intelligent people willing to volunteer their time to do such important work. And I want to thank you all for doing that. I have a couple of responses from your exercise there today. I thought it was really it was quite interesting, and it kind of demonstrates how difficult this work is. I appreciated David's comment of it just not necessarily being a no-go decision point, but informative to the broader work of the council, and an interesting exercise for the council. I also support the concept of looking at co-benefits, particularly in this context, because there are so many co-benefits beyond just the climate benefits, and you've identified many of them. And the one thing that I would ask you to continue to think about in terms of climate change is the concept of additionality. You know, when we think of like our landscape has tremendous greenhouse gas benefits as it sits today, and we want to maintain that, and we want to you know, acknowledge that. But if nothing changed from today, the landscape as well as the people on it would suffer. And what we need to be doing is we need to be figuring out how to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So I would encourage you to think about the measures and the programs that you put forth. How does it add to reducing the carbon impacts that we already have? So just thank you again for the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Gordon. Any other members of the public interested in sharing some comments with us this morning? All right, well, thanks everyone for a really robust conversation today. And I think it's great that we all seem to be able to work well together, even when we have some questions and disagreements around, you know, certain questions. So have a great afternoon. Have a great weekend. Abby and I will get back to you with a proposed agenda for next week. I don't know that we have much homework at this point, but if things do come up, we will communicate that with you all prior to next Friday. And I'm going to stop recording now. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.